This is going to be a short video. We're going to go through these things just fairly quickly about the American home front. And I've left some things out from what we would have discussed if we were actually in person. But anyway, this is just going to talk about specifically what's going on in the United States itself during World War I. Of course, there's going to be a lot of propaganda. There's going to be posters like the one on this particular slide, hold up your end, War Fund Week, $100 million and all that. So you're going to be expecting everyone to get involved in this. Remember, this is a total war. So you've got the military, but you've also got women and children. Women, Red Cross, helping out, any other kind of ways that they could send any kind of help, sewing socks, for example, to the military. Children, raising money in schools. There were things about save your quarters for the troops. And then the churches, of course, praying for the president, for the troops, and for victory. So there was a lot of religious revival that happened then. One thing I want you to know, pay attention to, is the Committee for Public Information, or the Committee on Public Information. You have George Creel, who is the head of this, and this is where we're getting a lot of our propaganda. See, the goal is to keep all Americans on the same page and be pro-war. So they were distributing millions of pieces of pro-war literature, which you would see everywhere, every public place, children's schools, colleges, you would see them in the libraries and the post offices and everywhere. Okay. Now, what they encouraged was for people to practice self-censorship. Okay. In other words, if you want to say something anti-war, don't. Okay. Hold yourself back. Now, that's going to change soon, as you'll see. Remember, the goal of George Creel and the Committee on Public Information is no dissent. Let's all have the same mindset that we're going to support the war and the troops and whatever. And well, 1917, things change a little bit. You have the Espionage Act, which makes it a crime to convey information with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the armed forces of the United States. You can read this, or to promote the success of its enemies. Okay, so anything that you might do that would cause harm to the United States, okay, or good to our enemies. So you could have death or imprisonment for not more than 30 years, or you could have both. I mean, I guess they would imprison you for 30 years and then kill you, I suppose. But anyway, the way that it ends up really manifesting is the post office, okay? So the post office was allowed to ban seditious materials, things that were seen to be harmful to our to the war effort. And the ones that they picked really strongly, first of all, are socialist materials. And again, we had anarchy as a buzzword before, where we were punishing anarchists. Remember, after McKinley's death and Haymarket Square and all that. Well, now we've got socialists. Okay, in the 1920s and 30s, you're going to start to see the socialists becoming, in some ways, the next kind of fall guy or the next scapegoat. Just a picture or two to remind you that protest is American, as they used to say, apple pie. Okay, so notice what they're protesting. They're protesting the Espionage Act, right? So Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press or speech rather, or of the press. The political prisoners who believed in this guarantee are now serving 20 years in prison. So that's, again, freedom of the press. Can you send stuff through the post office? Well, according to the Espionage Act, no. Okay, so that's something you may not know that we did in World War I. Here's another picture for a little illustration of what's going on. You have on the left from a magazine something, this is commentary about the espionage bill. Must liberty's light go out? And you've got a very sad Statue of Liberty down at the bottom of that magazine, cover. And then here we have, if you want to take a minute, you could read about Woodrow Wilson and about the espionage, and then the Sedition Act that we're going to talk about briefly in just a moment. And again, the post office is going to be deeming that there were 60 newspapers or so that were too revolutionary or had too much anti-war content in them, so they weren't allowed to have the second class mailing rights. I wish I could talk, you guys. And they were therefore banned from the mail. So anyway, the next thing that's going to really happen is the criticism of the presidential administration and its war policy became grounds for arrest and imprisonment. Okay, keep that in mind. That's terrifying, but it happened in our country. So in 1918, they're going to expand the Espionage Act, which was already pretty rough, you know. Going to have the Sedition Act. And what we're going to see here is it's illegal, as I said a minute ago with Woodrow Wilson, it's illegal to criticize the president or the government. You can't go out and talk about your opposition to the war. You can end up in prison. We have over there's a cartoon from the time where you have Eugene Debs. This is the year that he was in prison, and well, he actually, remember, he was the socialist leader of the strike where you had, yeah, the railroad strike, and the Pullman actually. But anyway, he was the head of the union, and he was opposing the general managers, trying to get the workers better deal on the Pullman strike and so on. But anyway, Eugene Debs is going to run for president several times. Now, again, it's going to be rough for this guy, but you know, when he does run for president from prison, he gets votes. Look it up. It's interesting. Okay. So again, he's a socialist, and socialist groups are indeed major targets, as I said. So, you know, we're expanding these powers of government to tell us what we can say and whatever. So, again, I showed you the pictures earlier about the people saying, you know, freedom of the press, and people who believed in that are now serving 20 years in prison. Well, here it is. Here's the censorship for the Sedition Act. And then one of the things that was out there as propaganda to encourage you not to even talk negatively about the government, the flag, the army, anything that might make anyone view the American government or its institutions with anything other than favor, right? Now, these are guys that are going to get convicted under this, are going to receive sentences anywhere from 5 to 20 years. Now, later on, we're going to see that most of those sentences are going to be commuted to time served. So they're not generally going to have to serve the entire sentence after the war is over. So here, besides the comic of Eugene Debs in prison, because he was arrested for this, right? But in June of 1918, he was arrested for violation by undermining government's conscription efforts. In other words, he was talking to people about the draft. Remember, conscription is the draft. And he was speaking out against it, and he got in serious trouble for that. He ended up being sentenced to 10 years in prison. Now, he was in prison from April of 1919 until December 21, when President Harding, who's going to be elected in 1920, November, and then take office in, I think it was still March then of 21, he's going to be one of the sentences who gets it commuted to time served. President Wilson in 1919, before the election, while he was still president, he had already reduced the sentences of about 200 people who were convicted under the Espionage or the Sedition Act. I kind of alluded to some of this stuff earlier in, I think probably in the other slide, the first one for this, but people were encouraged in the United States to hate Germans and Germany. You know, the schools were dropping the German classes, the libraries are removing all kinds of German books, and so on. Now, we have some really silly things down here, like renaming things like Dachshund. Okay, obviously that's a German word, Hund, dog. So they decided, oh, we're going to call Dachshunds Liberty Pups. Oh, I'm hanging my head in shame at my fellow countrymen here. German measles. That doesn't make any sense to me. to call German measles, that did used to be a thing. It's called rubella now, by the way, if you're interested. So as not to be, that's not racist, but it's, it's not nice, right? But German measles, why are we calling them liberty measles? I mean, if the Germans were the bad guys, call them German measles. That seems like better punishment than liberty measles. Okay. Frankfurters, well, obviously there's a city in Germany called Frankfurt, and this is where we got hot dogs from because we decide not to call them Frankfurters because that's too German. Now, this is one I have a note on there for you. This one stuck. It's why you still hear most people, in certain areas of the country, not true, but in our area here, definitely hear them referred to as hot dogs. And then hamburgers were Liberty sausage. Oh, again, I'm hanging my head in shame. It reminds me right after September 11th, 2001, people got all like full of themselves and decided that, the French weren't going to ally with the United States. And so we don't like the French anymore. So we decided to stop saying French fries. I mean, we didn't decide. I certainly didn't decide. I thought it was stupid. But remember, I told you this in class when we were still meeting in person. But for like a hot minute back there in that time period, they decided to call French fries freedom fries, which to me is equally silly. But that's the anger that you were seeing back here with the Germans and, in 20, 2001 as far as the aftermath of that and the fact that we were trying to build a coalition and stuff. There's so much anger, so we started using weird names to describe things. So now back to Woodrow Wilson, the American president. Okay, remember he wanted he had his 14 points that he wanted. This was a lenient peace settlement, and he wanted within that, if you recall, a League of Nations to keep the peace, right? Well, he presented the Treaty of Versailles after the war ends, after the armistice, rather. The armistice is November 11th of 1918, okay? But then in 1919, we're going to have the actual treaty, which is the official end to the war and the agreements, like we've talked about with Spanish-American War and so on. The Senate's not going to be falling for this. You especially have Henry Cabot Lodge, a Republican senator. It turns out that the people really liked the idea of signing this treaty. I'm not sure how many people in the public had read it, how much they had really thought about it, but I showed you on the other slideshow that there were all these comics, about the League of Nations and stuff. That was the part of the Treaty of Versailles that he would not give up. Okay, Woodrow Wilson wanted to keep his plan in there. So he went out and appealed to the people by train. We've talked about that. He's done that before when it came to military preparedness. He goes on a 3-week, 8,000 miles by train trip to talk eye to eye with as many people as possible. Sometimes he's making 4 speeches a day. And he's stressed out beyond belief already. He's not in the perfect health at that time anyway. So he has a terrible stroke in September of 1919. As I said, many of the American people are on board with this, but when it goes to vote, it falls short by 7 votes, okay? So we end up doing something different. Now, this is not a unique thing like in history. It's not, it's not a totally, totally crazy thing, but it is significant because we did not sign the Treaty of Versailles with all the other countries, okay? We signed a separate peace, okay? It's called a separate peace with Germany. We signed the Treaty of Berlin, okay, 1921. It took them a while to argue and vote and work out what they were going to agree upon. So the separate peace treaty, the Treaty of Berlin, which ended, officially ended the war for the United States with Germany, stipulates, look at this down at the very bottom, that the United States would enjoy everything that had been already given in the Treaty of Versailles. So basically it's the Treaty of Versailles. But they took out one thing. They took out the League of Nations, which was what Woodrow Wilson was fighting for. And we never joined the League of Nations. United States, we never joined it for the reasons, that we were afraid we were going to give up some of our sovereignty and so on. So socialists had become one of the new scapegoats, along with anarchists as well at the same time, overlaps for a while. But if you know anything about Karl Marx and Marxism, Karl Marx said that communism is a more evolved form of socialism. So the goal of Marxist socialism is communism, right? Now, the Americans see that the Russian Revolution of 1917, 1918 had made communism a real thing in a country. Okay, it was an overturning of the empire of Russia, overthrowing the Romanov dynasty. Okay, so now we have some fear, and we call this the Red Scare, because the thing is they called people who were communist or communist sympathizers really Reds. Okay, and if you were kind of just a left-leaning person, you sort of were a little bit more liberal, sometimes they would just call you a pinko because you're not quite red, you're pink, right? So you're a pinko. Anyway, all kinds of stuff going on here. You're going to see this Red Scare that happens between, well, it's over the late fall, winter, like from about November to January, from 1919 November and up until about January of 1920. This is our very first big scare where we're looking out to see what's going on here with these communists. Okay. Now you're going to find though that the president himself is going to tell his cabinet, the people who are in charge of these things, like Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, he's going to tell him and all the others who are in different departments that are going to have the power to do what he says. Woodrow Wilson's going to say, you know what? Any of these really left-leaning people, you want to actually arrest them and deport them out of the United States. Now, the thing is, it's not equal. You're going to see that a lot of Jewish immigrants from, say, Poland and Russia and, Czechoslovakia, whatever it was called in that particular moment. But you're going to see other groups that are going to be arrested in larger numbers. You're also going to see anarchists. And we'll talk about a couple of anarchists that are going to get arrested during this Red Scare in just a minute. Now, the Palmer raids is going to be part of this Red Scare. And it's really going to be kind of a, it's going to be kind of a wake-up moment for the American people when the Palmer raids happen, because we've got everywhere the idea that there's got to be a communist over here waiting to be, make you a communist, waiting to convert you to communism and all kinds of stuff like that. So they start going out, and at some point they're having raids of people's homes, and they thought they would get all sorts of guns and all sorts of weapons, all kinds of stuff, right? Well, it's not going to work out that way, okay? Because the Justice Department in January is going to launch some raids over, I don't know, over a few days. I think it was less than a week. And then they're going to go out a little bit less fervor for about 6 more weeks. Now, they're going to arrest 3,000 people and hold a lot of these people for a long time, waiting to see if they actually were communist or if they were left-leaning, okay? Now, you're going to have them going into people's houses without search warrants, arresting, all sorts of things. that we would not agree to today. Now, what we see over in the Department of Justice is Herbert Hoover. Okay. Now Herbert Hoover is going to become, I believe he's the first head of the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Pretty sure he's also the longest, the person who held that title the longest. But right here, he's working with his assistant, or I'm sorry, with his superior. He's the assistant. I'm not used to. I forget about J. Edgar Hoover ever being anyone's assistant through the Palmer raids. Now, what we see is there were indeed some bombings. There were a few things that had happened, and the big one was where you had a bomb that was sent directly to Palmer's house. Now, it turned out that it I guess it was in the mail, and it was a domestic woman who worked in Palmer's house. And so it's gonna blow up, to some extent, but it's not gonna really hurt anybody. It's definitely not gonna hurt Palmer himself, because what happened was not only was there a bomb at Palmer's house, and actually I don't think his maid was the one who actually opened that particular bomb. I mean, there were some bombs that had indeed killed a few people at some judges' houses, and there was I think it was a senator. I was sitting here trying to think. I think it was a senator that had received a bomb that his maid had opened. But anyway, you're going to have the Palmer raids going on for a long time. Now, they had told, the press and whoever else that they knew they were going to find so many weapons. And you know what they found? This is what is always so amazing to me about the Palmer raids, to end that part, is the Palmer raids uncovered, with 3,000 and more arrests, one pistol. True story. Okay. Anyway, let me move on to Sacco and Vanzetti. Okay. Sacco and Vanzetti, on the next slide, are actually anarchists, and they are immigrants. They were accused of murdering two men up in Massachusetts, and yeah, you're gonna find that the public is going to judge them the way that sometimes happens today. We tend sometimes to try people in the media without knowing all the facts. Well, when it comes to Sacco and Vanzetti, they were indeed anarchists. They were, Italian immigrants, and they were accused of killing, a couple of guys as a guard, and this is going to be happening during an armed robbery, and they're going to end up being put to death in Old Sparky. You may have heard that reference, the electric chair. There's a little bit more to read there about Sacco and Vanzetti. Again, just the pretty much the same thing I said. So protest and so on. So now the election of 1920 comes along. Remember what happened to my president here, Theodore Roosevelt. Back in 1912, he had tried to run as an independent. That didn't work, right? And he's been always a war hawk and everything. Well, he had intended to run again in 1920. Okay, the war is over and he's ready to go, right? Well, it turns out that January of 1919, President Theodore Roosevelt's last words were, "Please put out that light, James," to his servant. And sometime in the next morning, he's going to die of a blood clot in his lungs. Now, his son telegraphed all of his siblings, "The old lion is dead." Because remember, they called him the Lion, all right? So, and that's always sad, I think. Woodrow Wilson, Vice President Thomas Marshall said, quote, "Death had to take Roosevelt sleeping, for if he had been awake, there would have been a fight." Okay, I like that. I mean, that's goes right to the heart of one reason I love Theodore Roosevelt so much. And then you look at his quote: "Patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president or any other public official." We need to keep that in mind no matter who the president is and no matter who the public official is. Patriotism means you stand by your country, but you also call it out if they do wrong things. Okay, we had to talk about that with nationalism, right? So, anyway, the old lion had not left behind anyone who could step right in and fill his spot. So, slide number 17 is basically just some newspapers, some of the front pages of the announcements of his death. Who do we end up with in the 1920 election? Well, this is the first election that women are allowed to vote in on this federal level for president. So you've got, remember the 19th Amendment that's going to come in that is effective now by the time of this particular election. And we've got James Cox. Look up there at him. He's the Democrat. And the vice presidential candidate is a well known guy much later, okay? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, had not contracted polio yet. He got that as an adult. I believe it was 1921, because I'm also a big fan of all the Roosevelts, but I think it was 21. So, anyway, it was a young Franklin Roosevelt. And then the Republicans, we had Warren G. Harding and his vice presidential candidate, Calvin Coolidge. Now, the funny thing about this election to me is that when Harding wins, some of the men are going to blame the women. They're going to say, well, you voted for Warren G. Harding because he was handsome. Now, if we were in person, I would stop and I would look at you and I would look at the PowerPoint and I would say, huh, you think that happened? Well, the truth is, when women got the right to vote, for a long time, they basically voted the way their husbands did. There wasn't really a woman's block of voting. And there still really isn't a block that you can depend on of women that will vote either Democrat or Republican. Women are kind of all over the place. They're not going to be, we're not going to be kind of pigeonholed or herded up or whatever. So a lot of the men that didn't like Harding blamed the women, but that was not true. The vote was pretty equally distributed in many ways. A little bit more info on slide number 19 here, the election of 1920. Okay, Harding had chose to campaign against Wilson. Okay, Woodrow Wilson, with the war and everything, and so Harding says he wants to return to normalcy. He actually makes that word up, and it's come into our language now, but he coined that phrase or that word. Harding's going to spend a lot more money than Cox, at least 4-1 margin. And then here is where we have Eugene Debs in the election of 1920. I showed you the comic earlier. I've talked about this because I think it's just really funny and interesting. But running from the prison, he got almost 1 million votes. Okay, so keep that in mind. And he was the socialist candidate. Slide number 20 is just a Democrat presidential campaign poster. And you see on the left, there you have James Cox, the presidential nominee. And there you have on the right a very young FDR, okay? The one who's going to be elected in 1932, and he's going to serve until his death in 1945, okay? He's going to be loved by the people. And this is his beginning in national politics, really. Slide 21 is another poster. Here we have Warren G. Harding, and, basically, Mr. Harding, we're all for you. That's not that catchy. And you kind of look at that. It's of the time. So that to me makes it interesting. And I know you're glad to hear me say this. This is the last slide, okay? Election of 1820, last one. Okay, first one where women could vote, as we've said. This is also the last election campaign that people were having to listen to on records. You guys know now what vinyl is because it came back just a few years ago, but it's pretty old. When was the record? I don't know. That's not a thing we're going to talk about right now. It's older than this, much older than this. But in 1920, this is the first time that you were able to listen to the radio. Okay. So this quote, election campaign by phonograph, which means record player, right, was now a thing of the past because we have our commercial radio, which will broadcast the coverage, and it's so much more exciting to listen to it live than it is to listen to it on a record later. Seems weird, doesn't it? Okay, so Harding's going to win in a landslide, 61% of the popular vote, which is outstanding. That's more than Ulysses S. Grant from his, was it, I think it's the, let's see, 1872 election where Grant got 56% of the popular vote. This is enormous right here. Now, he's going to win every state except the South in the Electoral College. So that's the end of that. And I tried to cut out some stuff. So hopefully you got something out of this.